In a city of sand and stone, where rooftops glowed under the moon like quiet waves, there hung a single lantern that never went out. It lived above a narrow alley behind the old mosque, nailed to a crooked wooden beam that looked like it should have fallen years ago. The lantern was made of brass and colored glass, chipped at the edges, its metal scarred by time and weather. By day it was nothing special, just another piece of old city clutter. But when night poured in and a call to prayer faded into silence, the lantern woke up. Its flame did not just burn, it listened. It caught words that never reached human ears. The soft prayers people whispered only in their heads, the ones they were afraid to say out loud. Down in the alley beneath that lantern walked the people who never made it to the grand doors of the mosque, the ones who stayed in the shadows and pretended they were not searching. The old man with the worn hands passed every evening, counting his coins and his regrets. The woman with the tired eyes crossed with a bundle of bread and unfinished dreams. The boy who worked at the spice stall ran through with dust on his face and questions jammed up in his chest. None of them stopped to notice the lantern directly, but their hearts kind of leaned toward it. The way thirsty plants lean toward water they can't quite see, the lantern felt every one of them. It felt the old man's quiet fear of being forgotten, the woman's aching wish that her children would grow up kinder than the men she had known, the boy's secret hope that his life might mean more than haggling over cumin and saffron. The lantern's flame trembled each time one of those unspoken prayers passed beneath it. It was not magic in the showy way of stories with flying carpets and shouting jinn. It was something quieter, older, something that sat between light and shadow, listening without judging. It did what many people never managed. It stayed present. One night, the city lay under a sky full of wind. The air moved through the streets like a restless spirit, rattling shutters, flipping loose cloth, tossing sand into small spirals. The call to prayer had ended and the crowd had thinned. The alley behind the mosque was almost empty when the traveler arrived. He looked like he had walked through too many deserts, his clothes carrying the memory of storms and long silences. His face held the kind of tired that sleep alone cannot fix. He paused under the lantern, not because he saw it, but because his heart needed a place to stop running. The lantern felt his hesitation, the heat of his doubt, the way regret clung to him like dust. The traveler did not move toward the mosque. Instead, he leaned against the wall and looked at the sky, as if trying to read something in the spaces between the stars. His thoughts tumbled, scattered and loud. Once, long ago, he had been someone's hope. He had promised to come back, to build a life, to be the kind of man people could trust. Fear had talked louder then, telling him he was not enough, that it was safer to walk away. So he did. The lantern caught the bitter taste of that memory drifting up from him, the unspoken prayer that maybe it was not too late to be forgiven. Even if he did not quite believe it, across the alley, the young scribe sat on a low stool beneath a cracked archway, hunched over a stack of parchment. By day, he copied contracts for merchants and letters for those who could not write, turning other people's words into neat lines of ink. At night, when the city noise softened, he wrote for himself. He wrote about courage and mercy and second chances, then tore the pages up because he felt like a fraud. His own life was small, safe, predictable. He did not fight in wars or cross deserts. He thought his prayers were too tiny to matter, too soft to reach whatever force sat beyond the stars. Still, his ink kept moving, driven by a restless ache to make sense of the lives passing around him. The lantern listened to the scribe's quiet longing to matter, to the traveler's heavy regret, to the distant murmur of the woman laying her children to sleep, whispering hopes into their hair, to the old man's careful counting of each breath as if he might run out soon. All those prayers, half-formed and unspoken, rose into the night like invisible smoke. People thought silence meant no one was praying, but the lantern knew better. Silence was often where the loudest prayers lived. Its flame flickered a little brighter, as if trying to answer back, though no one could see that answer but the shadows. In that same week, the city began to change in ways that seemed small, almost random. The merchant at the corner stall, known for squeezing every last coin, found his hands pausing over the scales a little longer. The soldier on night duty at the gate found himself looking less bored and more thoughtful, staring out at the desert with the uneasy feeling that real danger was not always something you could see. The boy from the spice stall started slipping an extra pinch of herbs into the old woman's basket, telling himself it was nothing, even though he knew exactly what he was doing. None of them knew why those tiny shifts were happening. The lantern did. One evening, a sandstorm rolled in without its usual warning. The wind howled down from the dunes, turning the sky into a swirling wall of dust and grit. The city shut its doors and pulled its shutters tight. Lanterns went out one by one, choked by the sand. Only the lantern behind the mosque stayed lit, its flame wrapped in some unseen shield, standing its ground against the storm. In that thick, brown air, breaths grew shallow and thoughts sharp. The traveler found himself pinned against a doorway, eyes stinging, heart pounding. For a moment, he believed this might be it, that his story would end here in a blur of dust before he had a chance to fix anything. The scribe, caught in the alley, shielded his pages with his body as the wind tried to rip them away. Fear rose in his chest, familiar and ugly, whispering that nothing he wrote mattered anyway, that he was just one more forgettable figure in a city full of them. The woman struggled to pull her children away from a collapsing awning, while the old man fell to his knees near the well, too weak to fight the storm. Everything felt fragile, like the city was made of paper that might tear in an instant. The storm turned the world into chaos, but above it all, the lantern burned steadily, its light pushing a small circle of clarity into the tearing noise. In that circle, something subtle began to happen. The traveler, blinded by grit and fear, heard a sound beneath the roar of the storm, a low, steady hum like a memory of calm. He felt pulled toward the alley, toward the faint glow pushing through the sand. The scribe, clutching his pages, stumbled in the same direction, guided by instinct more than sight. The woman dragged her children, feeling a tug in her chest she could not explain, and the old man, coughing and weak, crawled toward the one place the wind seemed slightly less angry. They all converged beneath the lantern, huddling under its pale glow like shipwrecked sailors clinging to a piece of wood in a wild sea. The lantern's flame flared once, then steadied, feeding not on oil alone, but on the raw sincerity that cracked open in that moment. No one spoke. The storm was too loud, their mouths too dry. But each heart cried out in its own way, the traveler for another chance, the scribe for courage to live the words he wrote, the woman for protection over her children, the old man for a peaceful ending instead of fear. Those prayers rose together, tangled and unpolished, not dressed up with pretty language or perfect posture. They were messy, desperate, real, the kind that carry a certain weight. When the storm finally began to ease, the air tasted like metal and dust. The city emerged slowly from the swirling haze, revealed like a painting wiped clean after being smeared. Roofs had collapsed in some places, stalls were wrecked, and sand lay piled in corners where it had no business being. But the alley behind the mosque had a strange calm hanging over it. The beam holding the lantern, which should have snapped in the violent wind, remained intact. The people beneath it were shaken but alive. In that fragile aftermath, standing in the gritty silence, they looked at each other with new eyes. Something unspoken had passed between them. The traveler, who had spent years running from people, found himself staying. He helped the old man to his feet and felt the rough grip of gratitude in the old man's fingers. He helped the woman brush sand from her children's faces, and the simple trust in their wide eyes felt heavier than any journey he had made. The scribe, his pages smeared with dust and tears, realized that what he had just witnessed mattered more than any story he had copied in perfect ink. Here was a living parable, people pulled together beneath a single light, their lives crossing for reasons none of them had planned. Days turned into weeks. The city repaired itself in the way cities do, patching stone and wood while leaving invisible cracks in some hearts, and unexpected strength in others. The traveler started working at the well, drawing water for those who could not, turning his wandering into service. The woman set up a tiny stall near the alley, selling bread and simple food, feeding those who could pay and sometimes those who could not. The old man sat on a low stool each evening, less focused on his dwindling coins and more on watching faces, saying silent blessings for strangers. The scribe wrote everything down, but this time he did not tear the pages up. He began to read them aloud to whoever wanted to listen. The lantern above them kept burning, night after night, listening as it always had. It heard new prayers now. The travelers were full of apology and quiet determination not to erase his past, but to grow something better out of it. The woman's prayers held less fear and more trust, shaped by the memory of being carried through the storm. The scribe's prayers asked not for fame or greatness, but for the strength to tell the truth without hiding. Even the boy from the spice stall, who once thought only of escape, now whispered small hopes for his city, realizing that change did not always come from somewhere else. People began to say, in that half-serious, half-joking way of city gossip, that the lantern behind the mask was different. They said its light felt warmer, or that the air beneath it seemed easier to breathe. Some swore that when they stood under it, they could feel their hearts slow down just a bit, like the world paused long enough for them to hear themselves. No one claimed that the lantern granted wishes. It did something stranger. It made people honest with themselves. Standing under that light, it got harder to pretend. One evening, long after the storm, a stranger passed through the city. He was dressed in expensive cloth and wore the tired arrogance of someone who believed he knew how the world worked. He walked the market, weighed the people with a cold eye, and asked pointed questions about wealth, power, and opportunity. Someone mentioned the lantern behind the mask, laughing it off as a local myth, a sweet little legend about a light that heard prayers. The stranger smirked and decided to see it for himself, purely out of curiosity. The way people poke at things they do not respect. He stood under the lantern with his arms crossed, ready to feel nothing and prove everyone foolish. Instead, something in the silence there pushed against the walls he had built around himself. He felt every deal he had made that crushed someone a little, every promise he had broken, every moment he had chosen convenience over compassion. It all rose up in his chest like sand in a storm, choking. For the first time in a long time, he did not feel in control. His heart, which he had kept locked behind plans and numbers, started to speak, and the words were not flattering. He did not say an actual prayer, but the lantern heard the crack in his pride and held it gently, as if waiting. He left quickly, unsettled, half angry at himself for being shaken by a piece of metal and glass. Yet as he walked away, he caught himself making a different choice at the next stall, paying a fair price instead of squeezing the seller down. It was a tiny act, almost nothing in the grand scheme, but the lantern, miles behind him now, felt that too. It knew that real change often starts like that. One small decision. That feels almost embarrassing at first, nothing dramatic, just a slightly better version of what could have been worse. In the years that followed, the alley behind the mosque became something like a quiet heartbeat in the city. People came and went, lived and died, fell in love and messed up and tried again. The lantern did not judge their failures or hand out rewards for their goodness. It just kept listening. Children grew up under its glow, learning that they did not have to be perfect to be heard. Merchants stood there after long days, letting their shoulders drop, admitting in their hearts that they were tired of always chasing more. Travelers arrived with dust in their eyes and left with new paths under their feet. The traveler who had once leaned against the wall in despair grew old, his hair silver, his hands lined. He became the one people went to when they felt lost, not because he had all the answers, but because he knew what it was like to feel like a walking regret. The woman's children grew strong and kind, shaped by her quiet courage and steady love. The scribe's stories spread beyond the city, carried by caravans and traders. But he always returned to that alley, to that lantern, to the place where his words had first truly mattered. In the end, the city almost forgot how the story of the lantern started. Different versions floated around. Some said a saint had blessed it. Others claimed a wandering mystic had placed it there. A few insisted it was just old metal and nothing more. The truth was simpler and heavier. The lantern's power did not come from spells or relics. It came from the accumulation of countless honest moments, from hearts cracked open in the dark, from prayers to rot a polish. Over time, All that sincerity soaked into the place like water into dry ground. And the ground changed. The quiet revelation, the one not everyone noticed, was this: the lantern did not actually need to hear prayers to work its subtle influence. People needed to believe that something was listening so they could dare to be honest. Under that belief, they dropped their masks for a moment, and in that raw space, they saw themselves more clearly. That was the real magic. The light did not flow down from the lantern to them. It rose up from inside them to meet the lantern's glow. The brass and glass simply witnessed it. So the moral of the story, if it needs to be put into words, is not about a holy object that fixes lives. It is about what happens when people finally stop performing and start being real. Even for a few seconds under a hanging light in a forgotten alley. The lantern that heard prayers was, in the end, just a mirror made of flame and shadow. It reflected the truth that the future of a city, of a person, of a world, shifts every time someone chooses compassion over indifference, responsibility over blame, a small act of quiet courage over an easy escape.